Okay, in this video we'll talk about forms, HTML forms. In particular, forms are the way that we submit information to a website. So this is a critical part of the web development flow. If you want to collect any information on customers or if you want to sell anything, you need a form on your page. So the form tag always consists with an opening form tag and a closing form tag. And there's usually just two attributes. The action attribute is the URL that points to a script that processes the form. This could be a PHP script, it could be a JavaScript form handler. It could be any other kind of scripting, but usually it points to a script that's on the server. And then the method, there are two methods. These are HTTP request methods. There's one that's post, that's the preferred method, and it takes the values from the form and it pushes it up to the appointed script and the action to process it. Then there's the get method, which pushes the values of the form in the URL string, and it's public. It's not a safer way to do things, so that's why we use the post method usually. Most forms include input tags, and there are a variety of different types of input tags. So there's text, tell for phone, email for email, URL for websites, search, date, color, password, range, and number, and we can go over these in detail. And then a max length can be set on these input values so that you can limit things like phone numbers should only be a certain number of characters, and emails, things like that. Some new HTML5 attributes include placeholder, so it shows placeholder text. Autofocus will put the cursor in the first field, whatever that field is that you decide to autofocus on. So usually, previously before this, you'd have to do that with JavaScript. You'd have to detect the first field and you'd have to make that into the focus. Now you can do this with HTML5. Same thing with required. Required will not let anyone submit the form unless they fill out that field. So using the required attribute, it will do what I call soft validation. It'll do front-end validation or client-side validation. So again, this happens without any JavaScript. Previously, before HTML5, you'd have to write a bunch of JavaScript to do that. And then autocomplete, if it's on, it will grab all the values from your cache. So it'll pull all those values like your name, your address, phone number, things like that. So moving on into more form type of fields, the text area field is used for comments or messaging. So that has two attributes, calls, which is how wide the text area should be, and rows is how much space it should take up vertically. Radio input type is allowed for a single choice. So you have multiple options, but you can only choose one thing, and that's what the radio is for. You can see here that the input type is radio, and then we have a name and a value. And the value is what gets stored and what gets passed as information. In addition, you can add the checked attribute, which will make this value checked. And then the checkbox is allowed for multiple choices. And you can see input type equals checkbox, name equals service, and then the value, again, this is value is the data that gets pulled. And then we have a select, which is a drop-down. If you have like a drop-down of choices that you want to show, here we use the select tag and with an option for each item. So here I have options with values, and you can pick from the values. If you want this to be a multi-select, there's an option to set this to multiple. So, and then there's also an option for size, which will show more than one line depending on what that size value is, so that people can go through and they can select more than one without having to try to do that with the drop-down, which is a little bit more difficult. Forms should be accessible, so the label tag is important. You put label tags before your input tags or your text area or any item that's inside of your form. And then the way that you make the relationship between your label tag and your input element is with the for attribute. So you can see here for equals name, and then ID equals name, and that's what links these two things. So for and ID get linked. And then there's an additional HTML5 tags, the field set tags, which groups form elements together. If you have like maybe you have a section that's just about personal information, you have a selection about payment, you have a selection about, you know, comments, whatever, you can group those sections with the field set tag. And then the legend tag is just kind of like a header for the field set, so you can use the legend tag to do that. And then finally, the way that forms are usually processed, they're processed by the script. So when the form is submitted, someone fills out the form. There is some client-side validation on the page that usually happens with these HTML5 tags. If the submission is not valid, it shows an error and it won't allow you to submit, which is a good thing. You don't want anybody to put up malicious code onto your site or server. If this passes, it could go to server-side validation, so the script should also validate. So you have two layers of validation, one's on the client side, one's on the server side, and that script will check for things like, is it a valid email address? Is it a valid phone number? Just things like that. Are there no special characters that are added to the comments field or any extra code or things like that? So, and then if any values are incorrect or potentially dangerous, it won't submit on the form, it'll return an error. If everything does work out, it passes validation, the data values are collected as a string of data, and then they're put onto whatever could be done with it. So a confirmation is sent on the client side saying that, yes, you submitted the form. Something will happen on the change. Maybe a change will happen, like it will say thank you, we'll be in touch with you, or something like that. But then additionally, the client will package up that information. It'll either could store it in a spreadsheet, it could send it in a TXT file, or usually what happens is it sends an email to whoever is set in that script, probably yourself. Okay, so let's take a look at form code. So you'll see here that I have in this HTML document, I have a form with an action of blank because I don't have a URL that's pointing to right now. That would have to be updated. And then the method is equal to post. And then down here at the bottom, there's the closing form tag. And then I have typical input type equals text. In here, I'm setting up some placeholder text with an autofocus, and I'm making this a required field. Doing the same thing with the next, but this is an email type. And this one is a phone type set to tell. And then we can capture the phone number. So let's take a look at how this looks in the front end. So here's my form, and you can see the placeholder text that I have in here, and this is what it's going to look like, how it's going to appear. I've only styled this a little bit, not too much. So email address, it's going to expect an email address, and if I don't fill this out correctly, the soft validation will tell me that something's wrong with this. Same thing with the phone number. So it's going to expect a phone number value. Now for the date input type, you can see that it shows a format. This is not something that I coded. So if you look down here where I say event date, there's nothing in here that I coded specifically to do this. So this is coming from the HTML5 element itself. And then in this browser in Chrome, when I click on this, it shows me a calendar, and I can go up and down through the months, and then I can pick a date. So it's really, really handy. Other browsers might not do this, so you need to test. The next field is a color field. So if we look here, we have input ID equals color, type equals color. And what happens there is that if I click on this color chip, I get a color picker with some RGB values. I can switch this to HSL, or I can switch it to hex. Then I have this color slider, and I can pick a color. Now that is for Chrome. It might behave differently. Then I have a password field. The input type is equal to password, and notice that this is required field. Any values that I type into here will appear as they were a password. So that's password field. Pretty self-explanatory. After password, I have what's called a range field. And a range basically shows a slider, and I can set a minimum amount and a maximum amount. So this slider, I can slide it back and forth. It's kind of like a widget, but it doesn't update any values here. It doesn't show any values. So you might have to explain what that is here, or you might have to add some extra code or some extra HTML elements to explain how to use the slider. And then you could use JavaScript to detect the slider change, and then you can update some value here. For the next field, it's a cost field, and the type is set to number. And when it's set to number, it's like a spinner. So you see as I move my cursor over here, I get this up and down arrow. So I can spin through this to get to different values. Yeah, so, and it goes, the minimum is 5, the maximum, let's say that we set the maximum to 100. And I'll refresh. So as I skip through here, you can see what's happening there. And then here's our text field. Our text field has multiple lines, so if I keep typing and I get a multiple line situation, this can be expanded in Chrome. And again, and then I can see a scroll bar, so I can scroll through this. Next up, we have radio buttons, and I put these in a bunch of divs just to separate things and move things around. But the input type is radio, and the key thing here is that the name has to be identical. So the name for all of these is genre, and then the ID reflects what the label is for rock. ID equals rock, and then the values are here as well. And then this one is checked off by default with the checked attribute. So you can see country is checked off by default. If I click on the other values, it takes that off, and you can choose only one. So that's the idea behind radio buttons. If the names were different, this wouldn't work. It would allow you to pick more than one. We don't want to do that. And then next we have checkboxes. So we have the type equals checkbox. And again, the names of these are all identical, but the values are all different. And so I can click more than one. I can click all of them. So that is checkboxes. And then finally, we have our select dropdown. We have a select for devices. So the label is for devices, ID equals devices. And then we have 3 options here. The first one is selected by default, and you'll see a check mark next to that. When I click the drop down, you can see there's a check mark here. And as I choose a different one, the check mark moves, etc. Now, I have not filled out any of the values that were required. So when I click submit, notice that what happens here. Here's the soft validation. So HTML5 says, please fill out this field. So let's say I go ahead and put in my name. And then let's say I don't do anything with the email. So if I try to submit again, it says, please fill out this field. So it's not like if I put something that's not an email address in here, let's try that. So if I put in almu.mass.edu or something like that, if I click submit again, it does recognize that this should be an email address, and it says, please include an @ symbol. And then it also showed like a .com or whatever. So it will give you that validation that you need. So I'll put in my valid email address. And then if I skip the phone field, I think that was required too. Please fill out this field. Then if I try to put in text instead of numbers, let's see what happens if I click submit. So it doesn't check the phone validation. So you might want to put in a hint there or something like that. And there's also no validation for the format, right? So this could be in parentheses. This could be a space, right? So there's nothing. Some more elegant forms that you might find will split this up into 3 fields, and it will auto tab through the fields as you start filling them out. So that's that validation part of the HTML5 forms. This password field is required, so we would need to fill in the password. And that is HTML5 forms